So, hi guys. A lot of you guys kind of already know me. A lot of you guys have been through LearningFuze. I see a lot of new faces though also. So, my name's Scott. A little bit different looking than the guy on the picture, but it's me. So, I've worked here at LearningFuze for almost 4 years now. For the last 2-ish years, we've been teaching React, and I've kind of led up that whole thing. So, I've seen all kinds of interesting things with new students learning React. So, this is kind of like an introductory. This is my first time ever doing a meetup, so bear with me a little bit. I'll do the best I can. If this goes well, I would like to go into eventually some more advanced topics and even talk about Redux and stuff a little bit. But for tonight, this one's going to be hopefully pretty straightforward, nothing too crazy. All right? And you guys feel free to ask questions at any time. If there's anything that I'm unclear on or would like better explanation on, feel free to speak up. We got to make this last at least 30 minutes. So, I'm sure the first slide you guys were hoping to see when you came to React best practices was file organization. So, but it's very, very important and done very poorly in a lot of cases. So most people use something like create React app to create a new application. And your folder structure looks something like this, and inside of your source folder, it looks like this. So obviously, if we started continuing to add components, CSS files, just into the SRC folder, we would end up with a huge mess really quickly. So, and the reason that Facebook does it this way is so you can kind of do it your own way. I'm going to show one way of doing it. It's not necessarily like this is the way that you have to do it. By all means, you're more than welcome to organize your files however you want. But this is just one system that I personally use that I've found very beneficial, and it seems to scale really well. So let me open up a different example really quick. I teach all the time. And this is so much more nerve-wracking than teaching. So something more like this. This is a little bit more on par with keeping your stuff organized. So start with an assets folder that contains kind of top-level CSS, images. Also, if you had font files, anything like that, be a great place to put them. And then moving down the chain, we have a helpers folder. And right now, the only thing that's in here is the registered service worker that comes with the React Create app from Facebook. But it's a great place to put other files for any kind of helper files for functionality, something as simple as capitalizing a word or just whatever, just generalized helper functions. And then above that one, we have the actual components folder. And that's pretty common. Most people make a components folder to put their components in. Yay. But beyond that, and actually the interesting part of this, I'm getting to, I promise, is putting your actual components into their own folders. So a lot of times a component contains more than just a single component file. So you usually have a CSS, a test file, and the main component file itself. And a lot of times you end up with even way more than that. So what I want to talk about a little bit is how this also becomes very troublesome. So obviously this is a small scale example, but let's see if we can do this. So if I have my app component and inside of it there's an index file, and the reason we make it as an index file is so the import statement doesn't change. So if we later refactor this, we could still just say import something from the app folder. So right now, app is importing button, and then if I put button into a folder and then rename it index, I do not have to change this import statement. So now the problem with this is is I end up with 9,000 files called index.js. And depending on the code editor you're using, they're a little bit helpful, and they'll say like what folder they're in, but it still can get really messy. So a better solution to this, once again, in my opinion, is to not name these all index.js, because once again, it becomes very cumbersome, especially if you have Redux set up, stuff like that. You always end up with a ton of index files for those as well, and it can get very confusing really quickly. Now, I know with 2 components, it's not that hard to tell them apart, but as the app grows, it gets increasingly difficult. So if we instead leave this as app.js and the button as button.js, it will break our app in the way it's working currently, where app is just importing from button. And then we could change the import statement to be /button, but that's kind of lame, so we're not going to do that. Let me actually start this up really quick so we can see what's happening here. Okay, so of course it crashes because it can't find the button file inside of the app component. So what you could do is you could actually use a package JSON file inside of each of your component folders. And set the main to be whatever file you want to be the main file for that folder. So once you've done that, now we could still keep the same import statement where we're just importing the folder name or what originally was the file name. So once again, in this example, it's like, okay, why go through all that trouble? Well, let's say you built out this button component and you're using it in 20 other different components. And you decide, hey, I want to add a style sheet to that button component because it needs its own styles. So I want to put it into a folder. If you migrate that into the folder and you don't do something like this or call it the index file, you would have to go find every place that component was imported and update the import statements. So this allows you to keep your same import statements without having to go through your whole application and update everything. So let's see if this worked. It looked like it was almost giving me a different error, though. Of course it is. Okay, components app, and it's because this one needs the JSON file as well. So obviously the one downside to this is creating all the JSON files, but if you do it as you're building it, it's really not that big a deal. Come on, you can do it. Or not. Man, I did this like 20 times. Everything worked fine. Of course, it's going to make a liar out of me now. Index file. Components apps. It should work like this. Yeah. That's the point. But of course, now that I'm up in front of you fine people, it's going to not work. That's amazing. Yeah, let me try restarting it. No. Come on, you can do it. Yay, it did work. Okay. Woo! Yeah. It's like, I know this works. So you can see now, once again, the whole point to all this is keeping our import statements nice and succinct still. So we don't have to go nested deeper, components /app / some other file name. We just specify the folder and it'll import it. And then we can name inside the folder, we can name the actual component file anything we want. Most of the times it's probably going to end up being something similar to the actual file folder name itself, but it doesn't have to be. It could be whatever you want it to be. And what else is pretty neat about this, or at least I find it's pretty neat, is this works with any type of file. Oh, I didn't delete that. Surprise, you can put it in CSS too. So it'll work with any folder, any file type. The whole point of what the package.json does is it tells Webpack, hey, this is the file to load for this folder. So now I could update my import statement that is in my index file. So right now this is pointing to main CSS. I could actually just now say asset CSS, and it will import that main file. And just to prove it's working, because you have no way to tell right now, there we go. So it is indeed working. So with all that said, file and folder structure, very important. There's no necessary right or wrong way to do it, but it is something definitely, if you're starting a new project, that you and your team should decide on some kind of standard that you guys want to stick to, and that you got to think how quickly these apps grow and how maintainable is your system going to be. So, and I mean, even with this, you'd probably end up maybe going 1 or 2 levels deeper with a little bit higher level organization if you're growing this into a large app. But you got to be really careful going nested. You don't want to go too many layers deep. You end up with some really funky import statements. And then one other thing I want to talk about on this project is refactoring code a little bit. So if we look at our button component, our button component is a class component, but it is not using any lifecycle methods and it's not using state. So it's kind of a waste of a class component. Class components are a little bit more expensive to use. Now, in an app, especially this size, it's not going to make any kind of difference whatsoever. But in the long run, if you end up making every single component a class component, you are going to eventually suffer some performance issues. Now, it has to be a really large app before this comes into play, but why even chance it? Take the 2 seconds. If you start out with a class component, you end up not needing state or any of the lifecycle methods. Convert it back to a functional component. It can be done really quickly and easily. So something like that, now it's a functional component. Now it's ever slightly so more efficient. So, and then since we're on the topic of Refactor, well, you guys are stuck with it because that's what I'm going to talk about. We could take this down and make this a little bit more succinct. So, this wouldn't have worked anyways. Hold on. I was lying to you guys. Okay, so before we take it down any further, do what I always tell the students to do and actually test my code. Okay, so far so good. Button still works. Excellent. So we could take this a step further and reduce it down even further, thanks to ES6 and some destructuring tricks. So we're pulling all of this information off of props. Instead of doing a whole separate line for it, we could do it just as it's actually coming into the component. So we could destructure pretty much at the parameter list. So that takes it down even further, and then we can further reduce this, get rid of the return statement thanks to fat arrow functions implicit returns. And then we could even take it a step further and get rid of the export default button. Or, yeah, export default, and just directly export it. Now, what is the problem with this code now, though? It's a lot harder to read now. So be careful with your refactoring, especially if you have junior devs working on your team. Now, if you have some really seasoned people and that's all your team's made up of, I'm sure they could look at this and they could probably find ways to reduce it even further. But that's not the reality of most jobs. Most jobs, you have people that are still trying to learn. So kind of try and find a happy medium with how far you're reducing down your code. Even doing something as simple as just breaking this up a little bit. I mean, it's still the same exact code. It's still essentially the one-line code, but it's a little bit more readable. So once again, finding that balance of how far to take it down and how much do you hate the people you work with. So and then just to make sure this still does work. Excellent. Anybody have any questions on that? And here's the example of exactly that. It's like I already knew what I was going to do. Kind of almost like I planned it out. Anybody have any questions so far on anything? So far, so good. I'm blowing through this stuff really quick. So.
Sorry, I'm not always the guy to ask questions. Can you,
That's why I like you, man.
Can you break down the structuring in your props? Or not your props, in your parameters? Like, how does that work? Why does that work?
So it works the same way as regular destructuring does. It just takes whatever's coming in as the first parameter here. And if it's an object, it'll pull those properties off it and then create variables by the property names. So it's doing the exact same thing. You just don't have to do that extra line. And you can do that in any function. And then even if you had like a second parameter that was an object, you could destructure that as well.
Any downsides to that?
Yes. Would you like me to elaborate on that?
Yeah. What are the downsides?
Downsides are, especially in larger files and stuff, it gets really easy to lose track of where stuff is coming from and what data was actually originally being passed in, because you might not even be destructuring the whole object there. So an easy way to find out if there is other stuff being passed in, and instead of destroying the whole thing, is you could do something like and grab the rest of the properties onto using the REST operator, console log that out to see if there's anything else that you missed. So it's just, once again, it goes back to make your code a little bit more directly unreadable, I guess. But depends on your experience level too, because some people can look at it, it makes perfect sense. Good question. Thank you. It's nice to talk to somebody, you know? This was my favorite one. I should have saved it for last. Index as keys. So let me switch projects really quick. Looks a lot like the last one. Cody. Appreciate you, man. Thank you. All right. So, how many people here know at least a little bit of React? A good amount of you, okay. So, if you've done React, you've used something like map or some kind of loop to loop over some data and build JSX elements, and build an array of JSX elements, I should say. And if you don't put a prop on those elements, what does React say to you? It yells at you every time. You need keys, right? You need a key property. And inevitably, people love to just throw the index on there. This is actually a huge problem. And it's one thing that I read about, I knew it, and I mostly followed it. But hell, even I would, sometimes it's easier, especially when you're just throwing some code together, just throw the index on there. Until you run into the issue that it causes. And it's a really fun one to try and debug if you're not aware of it. So let's take a quick look at the code and see exactly what I'm talking about. So we have our main app component. The main app component has our header, and then it is loading a list component. The list component is this component that actually houses the data, has the remove functionality, and is using the item component to loop over it. So first things first, if we delete this key property, React instantly yells at you. So it still works. It doesn't not work, but it gets really mad at you. So it uses the key property for indexing the different elements so it can keep track of them. So it needs some way to reference each element in that array. So if I put this back on here, key, and then I'm using the map function, which gives me the item and then the index that each item is at. And if I just throw index in there, and then the warning is now gone because we satisfied React. React is like, hey, there's a key there, I'm happy. But once again, this leads down a bad path. So let's test this out really quick and see what happens. All right, so component 2 has a white background, or item 2, I should say, has a white background. Item 3 has a yellowish mustard yellow background. If I delete item 2, item 3 fills its spot, but wait a minute, it's still maintaining the state that item 2 had. Okay? This could cause you huge headaches. Does anybody need me to repeat that to grab the full gravity of what just happened? So no matter... Yeah. It's just a random color function. Would you like to see it?
I'm just curious.
Fine then. I don't want to show it to you anyways.
Show us the color function.
The color function. It actually generates the background color and the text color, because if the color is too dark and you saw black text, then it's hard to see the text. So it makes the text white or black depending on how dark the color is. Because I was cool and I wrote this in one line, but then I had to add the color and stuff in there, so it ended up being a little bit less fancy. So I just have a random number that generates any random number given a max size. I then generate a number between 0 and 255, each for R, G, and B. And then I use React CSS objects to apply CSS to some element. And in this case, it is the list item. All right, so do this one more time. So one thing I did not point out that I should have is if we look at the item component, and this is very important. The item component, each one of those items has 2 buttons and the background color and some text. Now, it is a class component, and that's where you really run into these issues. If you're looping over functional components and you use the index, you probably won't notice this, but it's still doing stuff that it shouldn't be doing. You just don't see it. So if we actually use a class component that has some kind of state, as these do, it remembers what color it is. That's the only thing that's stored in state here. The state remains at the index or the key that we originally gave it. So even though the text changes, because technically the element did change, the state did not change with it appropriately because of the way that React indexes these. So once again, we got, I don't even know what colors these are, teal, purple, a greenish color. But as I remove these, notice the colors don't go anywhere. The colors stay. The colors should be moving though, because the color is actually a part of each of the components. But because we're using the index, React is like, it's still the same index. It still has the same ID essentially. So why? I'm not going to change anything. I'm not going to re-render it. So the way to fix this is when you're looping over something is to give it some kind of unique identifier. So React could tell the difference between the different components. So in my example, my dummy data has these little fake ID things that I gave it. And when you're doing dummy data, it takes an extra 2 seconds to throw an ID property on there. So take the time, add an ID property to your dummy data for testing. And then once you're pulling data from a server, you should be getting some kind of unique ID from the database anyways. So you should already have that information. Now, sometimes, for whatever reason, there might just not be an ID available. But you might be able to use a combination of some of the other data that's been given to you to act like an ID, some kind of unique piece of information that can identify each element. Like if I didn't have this ID, I could actually use the text property. But that's dangerous for another reason, because it could potentially be the same. And if you have duplicate IDs, then you run into other issues. So just find some way to uniquely identify each object in the array. And if we do that, we say item.id, once again, that's just coming from this array up here, each of these objects. All right. So item 2 is the green one, and if I delete it, it actually deletes the green one now. So it's actually deleting the proper thing and rendering and updating the other indexes properly as it should. So delete the red one, delete the purple one, so on and so forth. Everything works as it should. So it's very important, and when I first learned React, I didn't understand the importance of this, which is why I find it very fascinating. Yes?
Instead of writing a specific object for it or array for it, could you just do like a math.random to get a random unique value?
That wouldn't work, because every time it re-rendered, it rebuilds that array, and you would need the ID to remain the same. Because each time the render method is called, you'd be generating new random numbers. Whereas it might work, you'd end up like causing unnecessary renders doing that. Good question, though. Thank you. It's good to see you too, man. All right. A couple other things I want to talk about on this project. And hopefully, if anybody here is kind of a seasoned React developer, A, I'm sorry. B, something right here in this component that you can see right now should be driving you insane. And if it doesn't, that's why I'm bringing it up, because I see people do this all the time. I see it in examples online. I see it in code. Like it's a huge epidemic. I like to call it divitis. And with React, people love throwing divs around any and everything, regardless of how pointless it is. Do you have a question, man?
I was going to try and guess what it was.
Was that your guess?
No.
Damn. What other code sucks?
I thought the function removed the declaration.
Ah, another good hot contested point. Putting fat arrow functions directly inside of your JSX. So let's switch to that really quick. Well, right here, using a fat arrow function here. That is a highly, highly debated topic, and I was actually going to talk about that in this lecture. After doing much research, running several tests, generating 50,000 buttons, and testing different speeds and different performances between using fat arrow functions, not using fat arrow functions, the performance difference is negligible. And that's actually what a lot of sites say. You do run across the sites that say don't do it, but most sites say it's unlikely to ever become an issue. And from that research and actually physically testing it, like I said, I was trying to find a way to demonstrate why it's bad to do fat arrow functions like that. And like I said, I generated up to 50,000 different buttons, did them with fat arrow functions, without fat arrow functions. And like I said, the performance difference was nil. So if it could handle 50,000 elements and not make a big difference, I'm not overly concerned about it anymore. And it's something that I used to teach up until recently, until I actually tested it for myself, because of course I read online that this is horrible to do. I do want to do further research into it just to validate my own findings and make sure that I was understanding the problem correctly. Essentially, you're creating an extra function every time it runs. But like I said, even like watching the memory and everything, it didn't make any kind of difference. So I would like to look further into that. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, so it's this div. There is no point for this div. I threw it here specifically just to delete it. And as silly as this div, like I said, seems here, you see it all the time. People just wrapping divs around stuff all willy-nilly. So, and then same thing here. People tend to, when they start a new component, they just throw a div in there regardless of what it is. You got to remember, you're still building a website. You're still ultimately constructing an HTML document, and you should still be following HTML standards. Doing this, if I wrap this li inside of a div and then render all of those inside of this UL, the div is now a direct child of a UL, which is not appropriate HTML. Technically, only li should be children of ULs. So not only am I throwing extra elements in there that I don't need, but I'm also breaking proper HTML formatting. And while this works, and even React Create App, who complains about everything, doesn't complain about that, you still want to avoid it all as much as possible. Another good resource for avoiding extra divs is using the Fragment component that is built into React. And I should have done an example of that, but I did not. And plus, it makes my list look better. Now it has all the lines. The divs were causing the lines to not show up. So much better. That line makes all the difference. Oh, look, it's like I knew I was going to talk about that too. Cool. So when you use Create React App, and yes, they do give me $5 every time I say that word. That's why I keep saying it. It has built-in testing in it. And depending on where you work, your experience level, you may or may not be doing test-driven development. Even if you're not, A, shame on you. B, you should at least be doing simple crash testing. They are very simple tests to write. All you have to do is essentially copy and paste the one that comes with that comes with the project. And all you're doing is testing the element to see if it's going to run or not. Is it going to mount? Is it going to mount without crashing? It's a very simple test to do. It's really easy to throw into every component you make. And it gives you a really quick, easy glance at, hey, is my app going to run? So I could easily npm run test. And it'll run through the test, and hopefully it'll pass. It showed because the app's running. So it ran 3 tests, passed everything. And it's a really neat tool because this is actually live. So if I go in and start changing code, it'll rerun the test and then tell me when stuff fails. It's a very simple tool to help you make sure that your app is at least going to run. So, I mean, I think you should be doing obviously more extensive testing than this, but at very least, you should be doing some kind of crash testing. It's really easy to do, really easy to implement, and it could save you a lot of time. Let's see if I could get this to crash. So there we go. So I know it failed. So it tells me right there, reference error, ASDF is not defined. And then, of course, I'll also have errors. If it was running, I'd get probably a similar error. Yes?
Can you explain a little more about what that test is actually doing? Is it like just running each individual component as a time to see if it's working?
I can. So what we do is it creates an element, and then it uses React DOM and mounts whatever component you imported into that div that was just created, and then it unmounts it. Now I know I'm just reading the code. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that. So what it essentially does is it just tests the component, runs it, and makes sure it doesn't throw any errors or exceptions. So as long as the component, all the code runs, then it passes the test, and then if it throws any errors or anything like that, then it fails the test.
Essentially just making sure each component you wrote is valid.
Yes. Yep. It's a very simple testing. Yes.
So if that component has other components in it, that means that the others are good as well, or do the other components need tests?
This does a deep test. It does render any nested components. There are testing techniques where you could isolate your test, where you could test just the component and it won't render any of the children components. So good question. So there's a lot of really good testing tools out there. The learning curve on some of them could be a little steep, but in the long run, they can save you a ton of time. And finally, another one of my favorites, unnecessary data in state. This is one as a React instructor that I see very commonly, and I remember doing it myself. When you first learn React, you love to put every piece of data into your component state, regardless of if you need it or not. There we go. So, I'm not going to lie to you guys. I really like you all. You seem like nice people. This is an extreme example, okay? This is kind of an exaggeration of the problem. But it was something that a simple app that I can make and then show kind of the downsides to putting unnecessary data inside of your state. So what I have here is a simple guessing game. And inside the render method, I have a render counter that tells me how many times my app has rendered. I think it's actually inside of a component called game, if I remember correctly. Really quick, not to like hammer on this too much, but one of the biggest ones I see people do is making buttons or making forms, and they always wrap them in divs. Once again, don't do that. The form is an element that's perfectly capable of containing itself. So try to not get divitis. Holy moly, I think I had every file open. Okay, so I have this game component. I have two different versions of it. One version of it keeps track of the random number and saves it in state. So the random number doesn't actually need to be in state and will actually cause my component to render more times than it actually needs to. Right out the gate, because I am setting the random number when the component mounts, I'm getting an extra render right away. Not too big of a deal. You know, one extra render isn't going to end anybody's life. If I switch it to use the other game component, so game 2, I am just saving the random number to a property on the class. Now, random number is never directly rendered anywhere. So it doesn't matter if it changes behind the scenes and the app doesn't re-render. It doesn't matter. The only time we need the random number is when we take the user's guess and compare it to that random number. So it doesn't need to affect the rendering at all. So now using this one, you can see right out the gate, we saved ourselves a render. Once again, big whoop-de-doo, we saved one render. Well, what if you have data that's changing more frequently? And this is where we're going to go to kind of go to the extreme. So what if I had data that was changing every second and a half, let's say? So back to my first game component where the random number is stored in state. Should have thought of a better way to do this. So now my guessing game, the number changes on you every second and a half just to add an extra level of difficulty. And now every time this random number changes, we're re-rendering the app. And nothing's actually changing on the screen. But since state's changing, the render method's getting called. And we're doing a lot of extra work. And it's really easy when you have a bunch of data that you're using to end up forcing a lot of extra unnecessary re-renders. And once again, in a small application, not that big a deal. But in larger scale applications and applications when people run them on their cell phones and stuff, this stuff starts to matter. And you will start suffering unnecessary performance issues. It is possible to guess the random number, by the way. You just keep guessing 5 until it's 5. Not that I tried to figure that out or anything. So if I now set up my other game component, let's look back at this. So this is rendered 47 some odd times. And every time I make a guess, it has to re-render too, because that's actually changing the screen. So there's renders there that are going to happen. So every time I make a guess, it compares the random number, updates the guesses, and updates the message here of if you're too high or too low. So those are normal renders. Those are what we expect to have. But just from this app running, it's re-rendered 65 times, and 60 of those were probably completely unnecessary. So if I now switch my game component 2 to have the same feature where the number changes every second and a half,
what's that keyword shortcut?
which one?
The comment line?
On a Mac, it is command /. Yep. And I believe if you're on a Windows computer, it should be control /. It is amazing. It is, because I mean, you could just highlight as much as you want and just boop. Even though it did it wrong just now. How funny. I tend to not comment in my JSX. As a bonus tip to everybody, especially if you're new to React, keep your comments out of JSX. They don't belong there, and it's really troublesome to have them there, and you end up introducing really silly errors because of it. All right. So here is now game number 2, where the random number is no longer stored in state. Now, believe it or not, it is still changing every second and a half. We're just not re-rendering the app every second and a half now. So, of course, if I make my guesses, I could maybe eventually get it. But that's all right. But even with making 10 guesses, my app only rendered 11 times. So significant difference. And I know this is kind of maybe a little bit out there of an example, but I intended it to be kind of a dramatic example because it's really easy to put a whole bunch of data in state because you just throw it there because it seems like, hey, that's a good place to keep it. But if that data is changing and it's not affecting what's being seen on the screen, don't keep it in your state. You're causing your app to do more work than it needs to. And that stuff does add up over time. If you have one component doing it, probably not going to be that big a deal. But if you have a large app that has, tens to hundreds of components, and even 50% of them are doing this, you're eventually probably doing several re-renders a second that don't actually even need to be there. So it's a very slippery slope. Be very mindful of what you put into state. And when you're first starting React, and this is who I'm talking to, I'm not necessarily talking to people who've been doing this, I'm sure you guys know this, but when you're first starting out in React, it is very easy and comforting to just say like, hey, I'm just going to throw all this data directly into my state. I know where it's at. It's easy to control. I have a method for updating it. But you could just as easily create your own little object that isn't state. In this case, I just created a property that holds the random number outside of state. It still functions fine because whenever the random number updates, it's instantly updated. So the next time I need it, when I submit the form, sorry, not the button, make a guess, and where I'm actually using the random number, it would help if I actually scrolled so you guys can see it, where I'm actually using the random number, it doesn't matter when it updated, because when it's using it here, it's whatever value it needs to be. It's not dependent on the render method at all. So please be nice to your state and don't overuse divs. All the examples from this, there's 4 of them. One of them is just an install of Great React app, so it's kind of boring. Not that the other ones were overly exciting. But if anybody cares to see any of the examples or play with them, they can be found here. And that is it, unless anybody has any questions. You guys have been great. See you guys. What's up, John?
I guess one of the ways, or some of the instances that divide is what necessary to do that would be like to an image tag or self-closing tag between divs.
Can you repeat that a little bit louder without your hand? Sorry.
Okay, well, I'm saying when you're saying giving dividers to different items,
Uh-huh.
I think an easier way, one of the ways I see it is when you're using self-closing tags to pass through like an image or a link or anything like that.
Yeah.
Because then you don't need, if it only has one line, it doesn't have.
Yeah, and along those same lines, people still tend to wrap those in divs, though. They're like, oh, this is a component that does an image, and then wrap it in a div. You do not. You do not want to do that. Once again, you're adding a bunch of unnecessary divs where there doesn't need to be them. I said it's a very common one. I said I see it pretty much on a daily basis, looking at other people's examples, projects on GitHub. You just see divs everywhere. And especially with the Fragment component, which is amazing, people should really use that more. That's the only reason I gave this talk. I'm just sick of divs. Yes, Cody.
In your game component, I noticed that you were not setting your state and properties in the constructor.
Oh.
Pro or con for doing it that way?
The con is it's new and I don't really care for it. The pro is it's the new syntax everybody's using.
Like traditional ES6, that was go narrow, right?
Yeah, well, it's now part of the. It is actually now part of the spec, which is why I've crossed over to the dark side. Yeah. Yeah.
You talking about the state declaration?
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't showed you guys that yet.
We've seen it, but I've had it work sometimes and had it not work sometimes. I don't know.
Yeah, it's pretty much most of the examples you look at now, if they were made in the last couple months, everybody's doing this. They also do it to bind their functions. They'll do this and then set it to a fat arrow function so it binds it. So. Anything else, guys? Yes.
What is the alternative to not using that arrow function on the CBAN?
Oh, okay. So there's a couple good alternatives. Where did I have an example of that? I think it was, but there's a button here somewhere, isn't there? Form. See if I did it there or not. I go back to the keys example. Demonstrate a way to not use a fat arrow function directly in the JSX.
What's the downside of using the fat arrow function?
I don't know. My reality got shattered on that. Yeah.
So the render function doesn't
It didn't cause any extra re-renders. It didn't use any extra memory. I created.
small amount of memory, so it might not make it.
I created 50,000 divs or buttons to test it. I'm not kidding. It would. Well, I started with 5,000, then went to 10,000, then went to 20,000. Once you start getting above 20,000, it takes about 2 seconds from when the constructor is called to when component did mount is called, and it takes about another 30 seconds for the buttons to actually show up on the inside the browser.
What a patient man.
I wasn't. All right, let's see if I can find this. Was it an item? No, must be in list. I know we had it somewhere.
Yeah, it should be a list.
Right there inside of remove. So there's a couple different solutions to fix this. One, if you're only going to use it in this one place, we could do something like this, where we just directly pass it in, and then we use .bind, and then rebind the proper this to it, and then pass in the index as the second argument. So that'll work. And up until a few days ago, I believe this was everything I understood. This was more efficient. Like I said, I was unable to prove it. That does not necessarily make me right, though, and I do want to still look into it because people have a big ordeal about using those fat arrow functions in there. So there's a lot of speak in the interwebs about it. So I would like to dig deeper into it. I just didn't have enough time to go much further than I did.
This only works when you have a single statement that you want to react to that, right? If you have something more complex, you need to map it to something.
Yeah, so if you had something more complex, so let's test this really quick. Make sure this still works. Okay, so deletes the items, still working. No errors. If you were doing something more complex, you would use some kind of, well, I actually am doing something more complex because I'm actually calling this here. Yeah. So, and that's to the other point of what people do too, is if you say, that will bind it as well. But I'd still, if not wrapping in a fat arrow function, I'd still need to use essentially bind to pass in the index. So it'd be kind of superfluous to do it in this example. But if I didn't need any arguments to be passed in, I could do that, and then that would work. But now I'm missing my index, so I would need some way to pass in my index anyway. So ultimately, I would need to wrap it into a fat arrow function, or use something like bind or something like that to pass the index in. Okay.
You won't have any issue doing the fat arrow on line 30, right?
No. So I said that is newer syntax, and it's growing in popularity. I resisted it for a really long time because I don't like it. I don't have a better reason than that. I just really don't like it. It's kind of hideous to me. But it's slowly growing in popularity, and like I said, you see it all over the place. And it does have its benefits. It saves you a little bit of time, I guess, especially with like when you're setting properties, like how I just directly set state. You don't have to, create the constructor, super, pass the props up, all that fun stuff. So it eliminates a little bit of typing for you. But I still don't like it. It's new and different. So, anything else, guys?